you, Alison, and welcome. We're here tonight to launch and in a sense celebrate Etienne's novel 30 Nights in Amsterdam, which recently won the premier prize in Afrikaans, in as much as prizes have rankings, and actually they do, which is a strange kind of literary sociology. The Hats-Off Prize is regarded as the premier Afrikaans prize. And Etienne has just won this prize for Nagte in Amsterdam. In fact, he has a singular distinction of being one of the few writers who's won this prize twice. Etienne won the Hats-Off Prize for, was it Turberg in 1990? Long ago. In the days when we were still struggling with formal apartheid, legislated apartheid, and not what Henk in this novel calls the new oppression of crime. So this novel, in a sense, for those of you who don't know Etienne's work, let me just say that, and I'm sure there may be some of you who haven't read his work, if an American landed here today and said to me, who among Afrikaans writers must I read? There would be a list of about 4 or 5 writers, and Etienne's name would have to be on that list. I'm not going to say who I think the other writers on that list will have to be, because comparisons are odious. But you can imagine for yourself. You just count those names in your own mind. I'll mention one, Breitenbach, and you can think up the rest. Etienne's name will have to be on that list, and so in that sense, Etienne is that rare creature which is an internationalized Afrikaans writer. He has particular privilege of publishing twice, which us poor English writers simply don't have, and I for one am quite envious of. He publishes to a very loyal, tight-knit Afrikaans community of readers who actually write reviews about their writers and whose academics actually read their own writers, which is not the case in the English South African Academy anymore. And he then gets translated and he has a second life. He has a second life. He skips the South African English scene entirely and just goes right over into a transnational world of readership. Those of us in the English-speaking South African world who read him, well, we're lucky. But I think we should count ourselves lucky. Etienne's novels deal with large, epic crossings, which is an immemorial trope in literature all the way from the Homeric epics and before and beyond. But Etienne gives this notion of the large crossing a particular historical specificity. And in this novel, as in previous novels, he deals with quite momentous intercultural, cross-cultural, transnational, in some senses, transsexual identity and all kinds of crossings. So this is a novel of quite momentous crossings. This is a feature of many of his novels, but in this novel I have a sense, and Etienne might want to correct me, but I have a sense that this is a kind of peak of career novel. This novel has a feeling of, if there's one novel you want to write in your career as a novelist, and Etienne has written how many now? He's lost count. It's in the region of 10 or 11 or 12. If one has a career as a novelist, then there's a sense that some novels you write slim, like As Besmiddag, the novel just before this one, which is a kind of not quite a light novel, but it was a slim treatment of a very particular theme. The novels before that were Een Stede van die Liefde, which I had the perhaps dubious pleasure of translating. But in fact, it was a great pleasure, but very difficult. This is why I say perhaps dubious. And before that, it was Mario Salvati. Die Lange Soie van Mario Salviati. So this book then has all those, and the final point I'd like to make about Etienne's writing is that he deals both in broad sweeps of design, large motifs across big historical canvases, but he also has a very strong sense of particularity, and he infuses the particularity in his novels with a very strong and particularistic register of language, which is what makes Etienne so very hard to translate. In this novel, and in the novel I translated, Een Stede van die Liefde, he uses a deep Karoo Afrikaans, a taal wat bykans onvertaalbaar is, maar hy wil hê dit moet vertaal word. En hy ken jong, hy wil hê dit moet vertaal word. So this is one of the interesting and satisfying problems in translating Etienne's novels. So much for introduction. Etienne, thank you.
Now you know why we invited you. Is this actually on?
Hello, yeah. Now you know why we asked Leon to do the honors.
It's just that I've read your novels.
Yeah.
Etienne, this novel seems to register a shift. If one looks at your previously translated novels, or the last three, this one and the two before that. So Etienne van Heerden, which should have actually been published before this one sequentially, but will come after, and before that Mario Salviati. These, in a sense, are your newly internationalized novels, in your career as a global English writer, or writer in English. There seems to be a shift from what was in those novels a kind of historiographic metafiction. And let me just explain what I mean by that. Etienne's novels are meticulously historically researched. They often have a list, not endnotes, but an essay at the end explaining the various sources he used. So they're not sort of thumbsuck historical, speculative, whimsical novels. They are very meticulously researched. But at the same time, he transposes that research into a kind of what we call a metafiction, a play in fiction with facts. Now, it seems something has moved in this novel. You've shifted your register. I wonder whether you'd like to talk about that.
Yeah, I think...
Hello? Yeah. You know, to understand that, Leon, I think we should look at the generation I come from. A generation of writers who started writing in the early 80s, in the time of militarization in South Africa, high apartheid, if you think back. And I started out as one of the border writers, young writers seeing themselves as new journalists, writing, documenting the realities of the country. In a sense, we saw ourselves as alternative historians. And the reason why our texts carry such a self-consciousness, or the meta-fictional, meta means above or looking down and looking at, why our texts are so self-conscious, because we grew up in a time of censorship and of great consciousness, being at school and university, of how information was manipulated. Information was propagandistic and very carefully, as you know, filtered in the old apartheid days. And we said, listen, we want to write it as we see it, how we see it. And the concept of I fiction is important. The I being the first person narrative, but then also the I that sees. So absolute subjectivity, how I see it. So that self-consciousness, which is part of this awful term, postmodernism, that we're also tired of hearing the term, it's part of that self-consciousness that you can't just write a story and put it out there, but you also have to show that you are thinking about the story and you are conscious of the fact that you are using language, that you are giving a certain interpretation to things. And that was the historiographic metafiction. It had a historical instinct, firstly, and it had a self-conscious instinct, secondly, of many of my novels. And I mean, if you look at writers from Jane Coetzee to Andre Brink, to Karel Schoeman, to many younger Afrikaans writers, and I include myself as a younger generation, if I may, we were very, now, things have obviously changed. And in a sense, one looks at the past in a different way at the moment, I think. There's someone in the audience who's doing a PhD at UCT on the whole idea of how writers at the moment are looking at the past and at history. And I can talk about it because she delivered a paper at one of our conferences recently in Port Elizabeth. And the interesting thing is that she shows how writers, especially Afrikaans writers, novelists, are very consciously working on using the text as an archive, going back and using the text as a method of trying to recapture old myths. And in this novel, Zan is one of the main speakers or characters, and I always say she's a compost of language. It's this collection of old Afrikaans references and idioms and plant names and old hymns and idioms and so on. So she's the carrier of all this. In a sense, it's a generation then of writers that look back and try and hold on, archive, to put it that way, the past. And very conscious of the dangers of nostalgia in the process, because if there's a no-go area for people who try to be intellectuals, it's the dangers of nostalgia, the dangers of being sentimental to sentimentalize and not looking at things as they really were. So it's a very critical process of archiving, extremely so. And so many of the characters in this book are actually people who collect. We can maybe talk about that. They are collectors.
So the nostalgia thing is a very strong trope in this novel. What I'm hearing you say is that you have to, just like Jane Buttier in his very carefully positioned writings, that's always carefully placed the voice he used in a perspective of what he can say and what he can't say, and within a context that the use of that voice itself is part of the commentary of the text, and how you speak in what register in this time, in this place. The same with nostalgia. In fiction, you have the singular ability, which you perhaps don't have in essayistic prose, of creating many levels and different characters who speak different voices. Right? And you can fictionalize those, but of course they're based on a sense of authenticity. So a lot of nostalgia is evoked in this novel, and it certainly speaks to the reader. I wouldn't be surprised if it speaks from within you as a writer as well. So there's a part of you that is evoking an immensely nostalgic past in a very old Karoo. And this is reminiscent of Marlene van Niekerk's Gat, where we have a similar, extremely minute and vast evocation of the minutiae of a world that's in the Openberg, which is also critically perspectivized. But do you feel that this critical perspective of nostalgia is very important as a corrective?
I think it's important as a corrective. I think, if you look at young people today, especially Afrikaans-speaking young people, there is a kind of a retro approach and a longing back to, let's say, the old times and so on. And it's important that we look at it critically. And it's one of the characters in this novel, Zan. She flees from South Africa and she lands in Amsterdam in the 60s. And she sits there at a cafe and she talks to anti-apartheid activists. And with her is a young black gentleman, also from the Cape. And she's very conscious of the world where she comes from and so on. And one of these Dutch activists, a beautiful young Dutch lady, very studiedly sits there with a glass of wine, a gracht in the background, and asks Zan, how can you long for this type of people? People in South Africa, how can you long for that? And obviously then Zan thinks about this, problematizes this. So memory in the book. And memory is always important in my books. We can maybe just now talk about the body, Zan's body and memory, and how it holds on to memory. So it's a problematization of and frankly what really happens at the end of the novel, as far as this is concerned, I'm not sure. We can maybe debate that a bit later.
Well, somebody make a note, we must talk about the memory in the archive, but before we do that, let's speak about Zan. Zan, she has an indeterminate name, so the post-structuralists would say the signifiers that signify a name are themselves indeterminate. So she's both Sun with an X and she's Zan with a Z. And this is indicative of the slippery trace of her being, which is impossible to pin down. And this is one of the things that is happening with this character. Now, just to bring this down to anecdotal level, I was on a bus riding to the Mnet Prize deliberations with a wonderful man called Gerrit Schoenhofen, who is a famous Afrikaans director. And he was one of the Afrikaans judges for the prize that awarded Etienne the Mnet Prize for this novel last year.